We're back with another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten. Well, thanks for joining us live for this first actual live episode of Bad News. So glad you can join us. We will have some terrible news and then maybe some more cheerful news as we go on throughout the half hour or so. We'll open today with the Cuomo conflict of interest. Then we'll move on to the New York Times' assault on unfettered free speech via the booming app Clubhouse. And lastly, we will remember Rush Limbaugh and hopefully end on a more uplifting note than the first two stories as we commemorate the life of an American legend. So with that, let's start with segment one.
Segment one. This is going to be on the Cuomo conflict. Ben, this is a personal one for you, so why don't you bring us into the situation?
Yeah, well, thankfully, I can thank Governor Cuomo for helping accelerate my exodus, my family's exodus from the great state of New York, where I spent almost the last decade. Really, Bill de Blasio played a role in it, too. And maybe we can talk a little bit about the spat that's ongoing between them right now. But really, this is a remarkable story of CNN essentially making an exception and then taking back that exception after the fact of allowing Chris Cuomo, the brother of the governor, to engage in a bromance too explicit, really, for anyone, over the months of the coronavirus crisis, in which Governor Cuomo, and many New Yorkers really believe this, I know because I spoke with them, thought of Governor Cuomo as a god. Of course, he immortalized himself by writing a book about it, about his amazing leadership capabilities. And now we find that, like so many other narratives, it's crumbling. It's obviously delicious to watch all of the leftists go after Governor Cuomo right now, including the state attorney general and the mayor of New York City. But it's very fascinating to see CNN only now walking back their decision to allow the brother to cover his brother, that is Chris Cuomo, to cover Governor Andrew Cuomo. And they did so in just such a brazen and pathetic way that crossed every line of journalism. I would say that it is uniquely terrible, although on the other hand, I would say there's an argument to be made here that maybe we should hold a lot of other media figures to account too. Like, why does George Stephanopoulos get to cover Hillary Clinton or any of the folks that he worked with back when he was in the Bill Clinton administration? Why does he get to cover them as if he's some objective journalist? Or, for example, any of the myriad other incestuous relationships that we have, like David Rhodes, the brother of Ben Rhodes, when he was working, I believe, at Bloomberg and CBS News as well, and his brother is the man with a mind meld at the National Security Council with Barack Obama. So on the one hand, this is a uniquely awful story, and watching CNN only walk back their decision to allow one brother to cover his other brother after it all starts to collapse with respect to his Governor Cuomo's handling of the coronavirus is one thing. But then there's also the broader issue of this is actually really common, and there's not a disclosure or disclaimer put on screen half the time, probably more than half the time, to reflect the myriad conflicts of interest that we see. So I wonder what you make of that, Emily.
Yeah, so a lot of times in the media, we don't have skin in the game. And, you know, that means we're talking about things that impact people who aren't us. We're talking about things that impact people sort of like in an abstract way for us, things that are happening to people in the interior of the country or in a lot of different ways that we are not. And so things can sort of feel abstract and they can feel like inconsequential or distant. And so it's easy for people in the press who in sort of like coastal enclaves to feel detached from the situations that they're talking about. That is not what happened in this case, but this is a perfect example of how the bullshit that goes on in the media has real life consequences, right? So like Chris Cuomo, the people sitting in these like Tony newsrooms in Manhattan who said it was fine for Chris Cuomo to interview his brother every single day in the middle of the crisis because things felt like they were going okay in New York City at the time, that had serious consequences because he was elevated. He felt like he was cushioned. He felt like, this is Andrew Cuomo, felt like he was on a pedestal, like he was cushioned from bad press and from general scrutiny. And clearly that like lack of holding his feet to the fire, whether or not that was directly related to this decision, it created this climate, this sort of uncritical media climate. And here we are months later, lives literally could have been saved if Cuomo was thinking through these things more carefully. But instead, the press was talking about being Cuomo-sexual. And that's like literally a real thing. They were talking about how hot Andrew Cuomo was and how comforting and reassuring the ritual of his daily press conferences were. So all that's to say, like the media's nonsense and their bias and their corruption, like this glaring conflict of interest, which I wrote about on April 3rd. And I read my article back last night. I wrote about this on April 3rd, and it was almost a tentative article because people were so taken with the Cuomo spectacle. They were so absorbed by it, and people were so happy about it. And my article was tentative at the time, but was saying this is a glaring conflict of interest that will have real world consequences. You think the Cuomo show is going well for now, but when he makes a mistake, you're going to have had this entire period when he wasn't getting questions that he should have been getting. And that's exactly what turned out to have happened. And it's sort of like sad to me that was prescient.
It's such a great point, and there are real world consequences to governors and other public officials not being held to account and scrutinized, because if he had to answer the difficult questions or even been asked them or anyone even considered them at the time, then maybe he would have had to recalibrate his strategy and not send the elderly in New York to their deaths. And obviously part of this is the contrast with Florida. So it's a huge disaster for the Democrats because they know that while Governor Cuomo was expected to be a potential presidential contender, look at how much worse New York has done than Florida, where Governor DeSantis looks like a strong figure. So there's the political aspect, but much more important than the political aspect are the impacts on the life and limb of American citizens. And here you have a case where journalists who always have just this puffed up view of themselves and how important and critical they are, in this case, they really could have played a critical role. If they had asked the basic questions that anyone with a brain might have been asking of the governor at the time, when you know there's a high risk population, so maybe you should focus on protecting that high risk population instead of throwing everyone out of work while the elites got to go off to their summer enclaves and not really have to deal with the consequences of it. The press could have done their job here, even just a little bit, and it might have actually made a difference. My question to you would be, do you think there's going to be anyone out there who's a crusading journalist that actually goes out and wins awards for exposing this cover up? Or do you think this is going to be memory hold and anyone who tries to actually pursue it is going to get crushed?
No, I think this is a serious problem for Andrew Cuomo because something I like to think about, and this was always frustrating to me growing up in Wisconsin, and only now that I've aged have I been able to sort of piece together what's happening. It's like when it snows in New York City, it is news on, like, it is national news. Why is that? Because all of these stations are run out of Manhattan. So if there's a big snowstorm in Manhattan, suddenly you're going to get all of this like news coverage of the winter weather. And if there's a blizzard, even if it's not, in a place that regularly gets a lot of snow somewhere else, of course, that's never going to be elevated. And a lot of people live in New York City, but all this is to say, when something does turn out to really impact New Yorkers, it has staying power. And so I actually think because most of the corporate media is located in Manhattan and in the New York area broadly, that's a really big problem for Andrew Cuomo because a lot of people are starting to sort of like, I'm right now actually actively compiling a list for a Federalist article of all the stories that conservative media was on top of, and then eventually the corporate media came around to sort of agreeing that they were newsworthy. And a great example of that is whether the coronavirus started in a lab, like if there's legitimacy to that theory. And this happens time and time and again, that conservative media is on top of something and is shouting from the rooftops, Andrew Cuomo is corrupt. There's evidence this came from a Chinese lab, and then are mocked by the corporate press mercilessly as irresponsible and reckless. And then months later, the corporate press around pretends that they never mocked anyone. They don't reckon with it. There's no accountability. And there you go. So, this is just another example of one of those stories. But I do think that it's going to have staying power for Cuomo.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the reason they ignore us and call us conspiracy theorists, and then their stories fall apart and our stories prove right every time. The reason they hate us so much is because they never had to deal with that competition from the peanut gallery in the back that is just looking at things through a common sense lens, like most Americans, and asking the most basic fundamental questions, which used to be the job of journalists, but now their job is actually activism, not journalism. So on that sunny note, let's transition to segment number 2.
Segment number 2. All right, Ben, what do we have now?
All right, so for this segment, we are going to talk about this new booming app, Clubhouse, which is sort of like a wide open, free ranging series of telephone conversations that anyone who's invited to this app, and it's increasingly blown up. So it's not just the insiders like the sort of Elon Musk, Silicon Valley types, but it's everyone now can go on and engage in these conversations on really interesting topics that are unfiltered, that can't be recorded, and that basically foster the kind of conversation that should exist online. And maybe, I guess, people will police themselves better because it's actually their voices and they're dealing with someone one-to-one and not hiding behind a keyboard. Of course, naturally, the New York Times, our fearless media, says you can't have Clubhouse. Unfettered conversations, as per this tweet, are unfettered conversations, scare quotes, should be there, are taking place on Clubhouse, an invitation-only app that lets people gather in audio chat rooms. The platform has exploded in popularity despite grappling with concerns over harassment, misinformation, and privacy. Before I talk about the unfettered conversations part, I do think it's interesting to note, despite grappling with concerns over harassment, misinformation, and privacy, I could say that the New York Times struggles with that too. I could say that most of our so-called mainstream publications, really left-wing activist publications, struggle with those very things. They love to dox people, attack people, smear people. They spread disinformation all the time. We've written at length of the Federalist about the Officer Sicknick story collapsing, and that's just one example of myriad examples, because they love to cherry pick anecdotes, whether or not they're corroborated or not, and then use them to create a broader narrative, essentially to smear their political adversaries. That's sort of the formula. On the unfettered speech part of it, it really is something that those in our media, and really this starts on the campus, and that whole phrase, that cliche about how we're all living on the college campus now really is apt. The notion that speech is dangerous, but then actual violence can be peaceful, or it can be a legitimate response to hateful speech. And we have no concept of hate speech in our Constitution, in the common law, or beyond. It's really something unfettered conversations. God forbid we actually speak openly and honestly. That's the real problem in America. We're not speaking openly and honestly about our problems. I mean, I guess maybe the ruling class believes that, because if we spoke openly and honestly, they would be proven to be failures, and we could actually hash out why they failed, how they failed, and what we need to do to throw the bums out and put actual representatives of we the people in power. But I just think it's so telling that the New York Times, which is supposed to, of course, be a defender of intellectual discourse and the marketplace of ideas, and it's just a joke to even talk about that in context of the New York Times now, finds this to be completely intolerable. And then on the other hand, there's a story that the New York Times ran just a week or so before that tweet came out saying Clubhouse banned in communist China. Communist China essentially can't deal with this free speech platform of Clubhouse, and we're seeing some of that now. So the New York Times and communist China are basically one-to-one. There's simpatico on the issue of unfettered speech. And I think that just speaks volumes about a theme that I keep seeing repeat itself, which is that our ruling class would love to have the control of the Chinese Communist Party. There's a CCP envy among our betters in the media. And then there's also the fact that they really cannot grapple with anyone else who tries to challenge their version of truth. And there's no such thing as my truth, in my opinion. We can talk about that another time. But they cannot tolerate any dissenting views. And that's what it shows. They show that just so clearly in this unfettered speech tweet that they put out there. So, I mean, what's your take on how should the media cover Clubhouse, Emily?
Well, so it goes beyond exactly what you just said, which is that they're uncomfortable with unfettered speech. They're uncomfortable with real free speech because, not only do they think that it's racist and bigoted, et cetera, and they have these insanely broad umbrella definitions and categories of bigotry. We talk about this all the time, and I think it's always funny how when we do media criticism, and I think it speaks to the sort of like depth that we come at it with is that like this comes down to academia's progressive or bigot binary that was imported from college campuses into newsrooms and boardrooms and Hollywood writers' rooms, which is that if you are not fully accepting of progressive dogma, say you are Gloria Steinem, who signed the Harper's letter, or Noam Chomsky, who signed the Harper's letter, you are being bigoted. And so if you operate on a binary predicate like that, of course, you have to be sort of restlessly policing speech because everyone is immediately capable of bigotry. And it goes one step beyond that. And the step beyond that is that words that are bigoted are necessarily violence. So if you are then involved in, Gloria Steinem signing the Harper's letter or Noam Chomsky signing the Harper's letter, then you're perpetuating violence. You're perpetuating violence against communities of color and disenfranchised people. And so that's why they have this like intense itch to police every single word that is spoken on the internet. And that's really what this Clubhouse thing speaks to. And that's why I'm happy that we're talking about it. And I think it's important for us to talk about and cover, because this article from the New York Times exposes this new impulse in the corporate press to have complete control over speech. Not just control, but to have complete knowledge, like hall monitor knowledge of everything that's being said, because that's now how they see their role. And it's pathetic and it's really dangerous. And I think it also speaks to the sort of like the silliness my generation of journalists has, and probably your generation as well, Ben. I went to school with these people not too long ago, and it's just like they're now running the newsrooms, and they have this like utter intolerance for anybody who disagrees with them, this sort of psychological weakness, like when you had all of the New York Times journalists in tandem tweeting that running a Tom Cotton op-ed put Black NYT staffers in danger. It is outrageous. It's outrageous, but it does speak to the mentality and how deep of a hole we're in right now because of that mentality.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head, I think, when you talked about the fact that it shows a psychological weakness. It shows an intellectual weakness, really, that they must control the official narrative, and no one else is able to communicate and try to challenge it and knock down their ideas. If that was the case throughout history, if there was only one narrative all the time and no competing narratives, and I hate really using the term, but no competing narratives to go against them, we'd be living in a one-party totalitarian state, which is, I guess, at the end of the day, what they want. The other aspect of this that's so perverse, you talk about certain speech in their paradigm becoming violence or being treated as violence, particularly against minorities. Well, these are the very same people who want to defund the police and actually subject people to real physical violence in their own communities, in effect, by saying that there should be no law and order. So they believe in law and order when it comes to our thoughts. And only their thoughts being the ones allowed to be propagated. But then when it comes to the actual, again, life and limb of American citizens, they could really care less. For them, it's always about the intentions. It's never about the actual outcomes of it. And I think I'm pleased that there is a platform out there that so far has been able to resist the efforts of our anti-cultural revolutionary betters, our fellow millennials, and I guess beyond millennials too. But all that said, yeah, this notion of the hall monitors in the press, I mean, it reveals a deep psychological problem that a lot of these people have. And I guess maybe, do you think that ultimately is an opportunity for us, that they're so intellectually weak? Like, can we just needle them so much that we cause them to implode? Or, as we've talked about before, are we headed for the gulags?
That's hilarious. That they have this like psychological weakness to the point where it can be exploited. I don't know. I never thought that way. Like, that's really like gaming this out. But I would say, I think it does create an opportunity in that it creates demand. So like nobody in this country knows who to trust anymore, period. And they're sick of it and they're frustrated about it. And they're exhausted by how hard it is to get reliable information and to sort of land on that point where you know that what you're reading is reliable and trustworthy and actually accurate. And so when you have so many people like that caused by the sort of nonsense and the shenanigans happening in, newsrooms like the New York Times, which are supposed to be the premier journalistic institutions in the world, let alone the country. When you have that and you don't even know if you can trust an article in the New York Times, it used to be that you could read it and say, all right, I'm taking this with the requisite grain of sand because I know that it's biased against the right, but I can still read it and absorb the information. And I know that it's not like completely, detached from factual reality. You cannot do that anymore. I don't think anybody thinks that they can do that anymore, from the corporate media totally missing the Trump phenomenon in 2015, 16, to them botching the Russian collusion story and perpetuating a conspiracy and a hoax literally for years. People just aren't confident, and that creates demand. And so if conservatives and media critics can step into that space on Substacks and on Patreons, then that creates, you can drive eyeballs away from these corrupt and untrustworthy platforms. So I do think that there's a benefit to this for the right, but it has to sort of be, the capitalizing on it has to be done well.
All right, with that, let's head to segment number 3.
Segment number 3. All right, Ben, this is a special segment.
Yeah, I feel like what we just talked about was in some ways a perfect segue to this. Obviously, yesterday we received the news that Rush Limbaugh had passed away at the relatively young age of 70 years old, and obviously had been battling health issues for many months. I think it's not an overstatement to say that this show does not exist. The Federalist as a platform probably does not exist. The conservative movement in America may not exist without having had the bridge from Ronald Reagan to today that was Rush Limbaugh. And movements need intellectuals, but movements also need people who can translate those ideas in a way that have mass appeal, that can take the complex and make it simplistic, and that can add humor and wit to it in a compelling way. And doing so in the medium of radio, for anyone who's ever tried to do it, is particularly challenging. To fill 3 hours of time every single day, day in, day out, with something that will captivate a reader when they don't have anything on a listener, they obviously have nothing on screen in front of them, is a remarkable skill to have. And to be at the top of your game and the top of your industry, and to really remake your industry and do it for basically a third of a century, is probably unprecedented. And so the loss of Rush Limbaugh for conservatism is tremendous. All of us who talk for a living, write for a living, focus on these issues, just owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Rush Limbaugh. And his haters, and there are thousands of them probably, maybe millions of them, just as there are many more millions who love him, are a testament to how effective he was. And one of the reasons why I think you see the hatred towards conservatives today and the willingness to try to stifle us is because Rush created the conditions that there would be tens, that hundreds, thousands, potentially millions of other people out there who saw the common sense virtues of the conservative movement and who wanted to go out there and articulate it and fight to defend our country. So we just owe an inordinate debt of gratitude to Rush Limbaugh, all of us, and his life should serve as a testament to the power of speaking boldly and courageously for what you believe in.
I want to play a clip from Federalist senior editors Sean Davis and Molly Hemingway as they were reflecting on Rush Limbaugh's life yesterday. I thought it was really interesting because I think I'm just too young that I wasn't an adult listening to Rush, in my car, on the way to pick up kids from soccer or, go to work or anything like that. But Sean and Molly were both just very deeply and immediately moved by, their reflections on Rush. It's a really interesting podcast, and I hope everybody tunes into it. And you can find it on all the Federalist channels. What was so interesting to me is that Sean and Molly are really masters of media criticism. And when they were remembering Rush, one of the most powerful moments was reflecting on his media criticism. So here's the clip.
Rush entering this space and being a voice for so many and hearing from so many and talking about conservative ideology with so many was huge. And it was really the beginning of the end, I think, for so much of our corrupt media.
I think that's such a good point. And thinking about all the media criticism he did, I think Rush Limbaugh was the original red pill when it came to politics and media. he was able to pull back the curtain and show us that, what we thought was behind there wasn't really the reality at all. He's the one, if you remember his television show, he would go on and show video clips and just show how ridiculous the media coverage was. I'm thinking specifically of a clip, I think it was after Ron Brown died, who was one of Clinton's cabinet secretaries. And the full video clip was Clinton yucking it up and laughing with his buddies. And that the second Clinton made eye contact with the camera, he suddenly went to the, very dour, sad, grieving, mourning friend. And when they showed it on the TV clips on the news, all you saw was the mourning. And then there was Rush Limbaugh on his show, which I think was on CBS, showing, no, here's the full clip. This is actually how the news is made. This is how it's completely.
That's such an important part of Rush Limbaugh's legacy, and it's an important part of conservative media as an infrastructure. As you mentioned, that Rush Limbaugh was really instrumental in putting that energy and momentum behind the creation of what we now have as the sort of conservative media infrastructure, the conservative media ecosystem. And yeah, without his energy and his momentum and his sort of stylistic talents, I think, we would be in a very different place. But it was, I think, important from a business perspective to just definitively prove that there's an audience out there for, you can take what Buckley did and you can sort of package it in a way that's digestible as you're sitting in traffic. And, I think that's something that's really informed a lot of conservative media coverage. And I think it's a good thing. And it will get mocked by the left who says that conservative media is sort of facile and, hayseeds and uneducated rubes, or they're just sort of exploiting the uneducated, deplorable rubes in their consumer base. And, they're actually much smarter than that. Or like the line that gets thrown out a lot is that conservatives are anti-intellectual. And that's just, it's not the case. It's just a different communication style, talking to people who don't think about these issues for a living, who have the privilege of not thinking about these issues for a living, and not having contempt for your audience. Because I guarantee you, a lot of the hosts on CNN they enjoy riling up the resistance and they agree with the resistance, but they don't even like those viewers. They even have contempt for those viewers. And so I know I'm coming in and out of focus here on my portrait mode, but if you could get past that and appreciate the broader point, which is, there's something really to be said about, as much as the left is going to decry it as being anti-intellectual, there's something to be said about coming from a place of appreciation, respect, and sort of person-to-person common bond with your listeners or with your readers or with your viewers that Rush Limbaugh had, and that I think has been really essential to conservative media.
Yeah, being able to communicate with and touch the hearts of millions of people is just an amazing trait to have, and to do it on serious issues and sometimes funny issues, but often serious issues in politics, like, for example, that Bill Clinton clip, which everyone should go see if you haven't seen it, because it really is amazing. And it does perfectly crystallize both the Clintons and then the media that loves them and has covered for them for so many years. And thank God Rush exposed them. But on that point about the anti-intellectualism, first of all, it takes an amazing intellect, again, to be able to take the kinds of ideas and connect seemingly disparate points that Rush did on a daily basis and then make them palatable and digestible for a mass audience. It's almost impossible to do. It's a tremendous skill set. But then the other aspect of this is, I always go back to the sort of famous Nixon versus Kennedy debates, of course, before either of us were born, but you read about it and you see the video of it. And in those Nixon-Kennedy debates, everyone who saw it on TV essentially said that Kennedy won because Nixon looked, sort of shifty and was sweating and the like, whereas Kennedy looked cool as a cucumber, as he would. But everyone who heard it on radio said that Nixon clobbered Kennedy. Those who can win on radio, that is, develop an audience because they put forth something that's compelling, really must have the better ideas. And that's why that's one of the reasons or ways that I would attribute the fact that half the country still has their heads on relatively straight, in spite of being under constant propagandistic assault from the media and the academy and woke capital and big tech and Hollywood and beyond, is because ultimately we are the 50% of the country that actually listens to the substance and the merits of the issues. And Rush Limbaugh understood that, and he was able to do it again in a package that no one else could put together, with parody and humor and sort of faux self-deprecating haughtiness and all of the bells and whistles that made it a really unique program. And it was a little bit before my time too, even though I definitely listened to Rush plenty whenever I could. But even listening to sports talk radio as a kid, I am sure that Rush Limbaugh had an influence on that medium within the radio medium as well. And it's just a remarkable figure, a force of nature, and he's irreplaceable.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point about even Rush Limbaugh's influence in sports radio, and I mean just the industry in general. And one final point on all of this is that, again, the sort of mockery or contempt for Rush Limbaugh as an anti-intellectual and for his, allegedly his singular influence on the conservative movement being this sort of strain of anti-intellectualism. Actually, he sort of came before this time where we had to be, where Clubhouse was being monitored restlessly by New York Times reporters, and he didn't always get it right, and he admitted that. And he's very much a product of a bygone era where pundits and hosts and political thinkers and writers and the people sort of at the forefront of our public discourse and everyday people around the country felt more comfortable talking about what they actually believed at barbecues, felt more comfortable talking what they actually believed in on panels. It goes from the barbecue to the panel, right? Like, we had a culture where people spoke more freely, and that may have, hurt people things when other people get wrong, but we sort of dealt with it. And we worked through it, and we had reasons to do that, and we learned from it. And we don't even have that anymore. I mean, we can't even really talk without New York Times reports. Like, nobody can even talk for 10 seconds on Clubhouse without the New York Times getting hysterical over the fact that they didn't have a full transcript of what was uttered in the 2 seconds when they went to go get another kombucha. So it's just that's a sort of sad reality. But I think part of his power was also that he was willing to speak freely and share his thoughts. And he did it for 3 hours a day and didn't always get it right. But he was honest about what he was thinking.
Yeah, and people respect honesty. And I think people respect honesty and truth and giving your unvarnished opinion even more in a time when these dark forces want to blot it all out, including the media, which is supposed to exist to illuminate those voices. But so if there's one sort of takeaway from the life of Rush Limbaugh, and there are many of them, is to speak boldly and courageously and fearlessly, because in doing so, we don't give our sanction to those on the other side who wish to stifle us and shut us up and confine us to these sort of intellectual cul-de-sacs where ultimately we're smeared and targeted and maligned. No, you have to speak openly and honestly and fearlessly and courageously, and you'll win your respect of your adversaries in so doing, even if it's grudging.
Absolutely.
With that, thank you so much for joining us for this first live edition of Bad News. I hope you'll subscribe everywhere you can get it, including YouTube and elsewhere on every social media channel. I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
Take care.